Welcome everyone to this session of the Mexican Studies Seminar at the Katz Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago. My name is Emilio Curie, I'm its director, and today we're really honored to have as our speaker Sue Stokes, who I think needs no introduction to most of you. She is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. She is also the director of the Chicago Center on Democracy, and as I understand it, the current or incoming, not sure, president of the American Political Science Association. A great honor indeed. She is the author or co-author of 6 books on democratic processes, mainly in Latin America, and the editor or co-editor of as many other volumes. Her most recent work, which prompted this invitation, is entitled The Backsliders: Why Leaders Undermine Their Own Democracies. And Mexico is among the countries studied in that book. So, with that in mind, we've asked her to make a presentation today entitled Democratic Backsliding in Mexico and Beyond. For those of you who haven't been here before, we will have a presentation, and at the conclusion of it, we'll have some time for questions and comments. And then we'll end promptly around 2 o'clock. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and welcome to Sue Stokes. It is really great to have you in our seminar today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emilio. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think we have slides coming. There we go. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in. I hope your weather is better than our weather here in Chicago, those of you who aren't here. My talk, as Emilio mentioned, my talk draws on my recent book about democratic backsliding or democratic erosion. And just as sort of background, I'll mention that research defined democratic erosion as a process of executive aggrandizement. So elected presidents or prime ministers undermine the independent. They come to office through free and fair elections, and then usually pretty swiftly kind of pivot toward strategies of undermining the institutions over which they preside. They chip away at the independence of the courts. They attack the press and opposition parties. They might attack independent election bodies and the like. Alberto, you can move to the next slide. So this is a table that comes from my book, and if I had written the book during the Trump 2 administration, if I had written it more recently, it would look a little different. But in any case, it gives you a sense of what we call the playbook, which is a kind of depressingly cookie cutter or repeated set of strategies and actions that backsliding leaders take. This is not a comprehensive list, but it gives you a flavor for some of the things that they do. The targets, they include the press. They censor the press or induce self-censorship. In some cases, they engage in extrajudicial killings of journalists or wink at such attacks. They go after the courts. Their own courts. They may change the composition of the courts. They may defy their orders or decisions. They attack elections, both particular elections and their outcomes, and also election administration bodies. They might reduce ballot access or commonly they dispute the outcomes of elections which they don't win, and undermine people's faith, their citizens' faith in elections, confidence in elections. They obviously attack the legislature, especially the opposition parties in the legislature. They may defy the oversight of the legislature, as in the U.S. in Trump's first term. And at an extreme, they will close the legislature and ban opposition parties, as has been true in Nicaragua in recent years. They attach the civil administration or bureaucracy. They often politicize it. We're seeing a lot of that in the U.S. today. And then subject it to regulatory harassment and other strategies. They also attack other kinds of public bodies, and they attack civil society organizations. They may impose regulatory harassment on them or just close them down altogether, deem them to be illegal. That's another common strategy. So next slide, please. So this is a set of countries that are on my list and the list of folks who use the kind of method that I've been using to discern cases of democratic backsliding from more kind of garden variety, run-of-the-mill executives exercising, sort of flexing their muscles. And I can, in the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk more about the specific procedures that we use. The attempt is to be quite rigorous in making that distinction. But you can see that there are cases of democratic backsliding in pretty much all world regions. The set of countries that that are considered to be cases of backsliding does include Mexico during the sexenio of Andrés Miguel López Obrador, Manuel López Obrador, excuse me. AMLO was a kind of example of a left populist backslider. So a politician who was committed to sort of policies that were favorable to lower income groups and actually also toward sort of racial and ethnic minorities. Um, uh, and that's true. He is in common there. There's a set of sort of left populist backsliding leaders that include Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Jacob Zuma in South Africa. And then the other sort of flavor that these backsliding leaders come in is right-wing ethno-nationalists. So those are leaders who are usually either overtake or break off, offshoot of conservative parties, ones that are more hostile toward redistribution or a role of the state in the economy to favor lower income folks, and who vilify ethnic or racial or religious others, or quite commonly migrants, often as an effort to kind of distract attention from economic hardships of the people who they would define as sort of the real people of the country. So whether they're from the right or the left, so let me just say that set, the right-wing ethno-nationalist backsliders includes Donald Trump in the United States, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and the PIS government in Poland, Narendra Modi in India, and a number of other places. So whether they're from the right or the left, one thing that many backsliding countries share is as a kind of background feature is high levels of income inequality. If you go to the next slide, please, Alberto. So together with my colleague Eli Rao from Tec de Monterrey, we recently published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and this figure comes from that analysis. And basically what we discovered with a kind of, cross-national statistical study is that the key sort of structural factor that's predictive of a higher risk of democratic backsliding among democracies is income inequality. And this figure simply shows that this is from a bivariate analysis, but it holds up to all kinds of statistical controls as well. It shows that the higher the Gini coefficient, so the higher the level of income inequality, the higher the probability of a country electing a leader who will go on to erode the democracy. And this was a result that really struck us, both because it's inherently interesting and important, but also incredibly robust. We measured inequality in lots of different ways. We estimated lots of different statistical models. We excluded, country by country and reran the models, and again and again, we got this very strong, startling result of income inequality as a kind of predictor of democratic backsliding, more so than, for example, income per capita and some other factors. Okay. So what's the link between income inequality and democratic erosion? Well, in my book, I devote a lot of space to teasing out a number of connections. And I won't have time to go into them in detail now, but I can just say briefly that one of them is that societies that experience high levels of inequality, there tends to arise a kind of sense of grievance and of being left behind by people at the bottom. There also can be a kind of sense of lack of a shared destiny or shared rights with people at the top, vis-a-vis people at the bottom. Countries that are very unequal are also tend to be more polarized in partisan terms. And polarization, as you probably know, has received a lot of attention as a kind of an aid to backsliding leaders. The the more polarized a society on partisan lines, the more people will be willing to say to themselves, well, I'm not so happy with what he's doing to the courts or to the press or to the rule of law, but God forbid that the other side get in. Catastrophic. And of course, the fact that polarization is an aid to backsliding leaders means that these leaders encourage polarization. So there's sort of you can think of polarization both as a sort of spontaneous effect of high income inequality, but also as a kind of cultivated or encouraged feature of these societies once a backsliding leader comes to power. Next slide, please. So this is just showing you some data supporting the idea that eroding democracies are prone to polarization. If you go, this is using data from Varieties of Democracy. If you go back to 1995, the level of partisan, this is affective polarization, just basically how much do people hate the people from the other party. If you go back to about 1995, on average, they're not the eroding countries and non-eroding countries. That is, countries that would go on to experience democratic erosions and those that would not. They're not very different in the level of partisan polarization, but there's growing polarization in eroding democracies. Okay. Yeah, here is an example of polarizing rhetoric. This not from Mexico, but from Donald Trump in the United States. The radical Democrats, this is going to sound very familiar. The radical Democrats want to raise your taxes. They want to impose socialism on our incredible nation, make it Venezuela. This is before Trump discovered his inner Chavismo. They want to take away your health care, destroy your Second Amendment. Democrats have become the party of crime, truly turned into an angry mob bent on destroying anything or anyone in their path. So, kind of extreme caricatured kind of description. But you can imagine that if you are a person who likes Donald Trump, if you're a MAGA Republican, and you hear this discourse and you believe it, you're going to hate Democrats even more than you maybe already do. Um, so, so this gives you a sense both of, I've tried to explain in theoretical terms why polarization is good for backsliding leaders, and then this is just sort of anecdotal evidence of the way that these kinds of leaders try to encourage it. So, but there are perils to polarizing discourse and polarizing strategy from the standpoint of the would-be autocrat. It may cause a backlash among opponents. So if you are a Democrat listening to this speech, you may be that much more Democratic leaning person who hears this speech. You may be that much more inclined to be mobilized in favor of the opponents of Donald Trump. In my research, I became persuaded that polarization is not the whole story, as to how it is that backsliding leaders keep on top of public opinion, even when they do things that people don't necessarily like. Many leaders spend a lot of time talking not about how terrible the opposition is, but how terrible the country's institutions are. And I call this trash talking democracy. The idea is not that these leaders trash talk democracy in general as a system of government, but that they cast deep aspersions on particular institutions in their democracy. If polarizing discourse is supposed to make people think, I might not like everything he does, but better him than the opposition, trash talk is supposed to make them think it doesn't matter if he attacks the courts, the INE, those institutions are rotten anyway. Next slide, please. So here is an example of democratic trash talk, this time by López Obrador. This comes from Mañanera's presentation. I won't read the whole thing, but you can see he's casting aspersions here, deep aspersions. He's calling attention. Here the attack is on the judiciary, and he's calling it inefficient, corrupt, rotten, pricey. and so forth. That, of course, in a context of trying to oppose the decisions of the judiciary. So some of you might be tempted to say that this isn't trash talk, or if it is, it's pretty accurate. There certainly is corruption and inefficiency and so forth in the Mexican judiciary and has been, but my understanding from experts on the Mexican courts is that it's really a better description of the state judiciaries than of the federal judiciary as it was during López Obrador's term in office. I follow scholars like Azul Aguilar and Julio Rios Figueroa, Azul in particular has really great research into the kind of background and qualifications of judges, and in general they're quite high level and professional. So. So if the theory is that democratic trash talk makes the public more open to executive attacks on institutions, a key question is, does that work? So maybe they go around, people like AMLO go around saying these things, but maybe people have their own ideas or they discount what he says and so forth. So one of the things that for several co-authors and I have tried to do, and also some of the material in my book, is trying to answer that question. What actually is the effect of democratic trash talk on public opinion? So we we have used various techniques both to study the sort of discursive structure of speech, like Chavez's in Venezuela, like Trump's, like López Obrador's. We've been able to use large language models to do a lot in terms of just sort of being able to say with more rigor and clarity what it is that they do say, what do they not say. Is there such a thing as trash talk that doesn't blend together, bleed together entirely with partisan discourse? But what I'm going to focus on here in terms of sort of understanding the impact of democratic trash talk on the Mexican public is a couple of experiments that we have done, survey experiments that we conducted to answer these questions. So one of these was meant to probe the impact of trash talking statements about the judiciary on people's support for democracy and their support for sort of judicial independence. So many of you will know, but the logic of survey experiments, experimental research, is that if you have a large enough sample and randomly assign respondents to a kind of a control condition and then a treatment that you're interested in seeing the effect of it, then you can have some confidence that any differences that you find in in statements or views or what have you of the people who were in the treatment condition really had to do with whatever you treated them with. And this is, of course, drawing on many centuries of medical research. It's the same logic. I personally bring a fair amount of healthy skepticism to some of this research, but it is quite helpful, I think, in sort of getting a feel for the impact of this kind of discourse on people. So in September 2023, we conducted an experiment in Mexico where we randomly assigned respondents to two distinct statements made by López Obrador, both of them about the Mexican judiciary. So one of the statements is quite anodyne. It just describes the role of the judiciary in the sort of constitutional structure of Mexico. And the other one includes derogatory statements that are drawn from the diatribe, the Mañaneras discourse that I just showed you a longer version of. Because we're randomly assigning people to the control, the sort of soft, anodyne statements about the court versus the kind of diatribe against the court, differences in what people say afterwards about democracy, about the courts, you can pretty confidently ascribe them to whatever they read, that the harsh statements that AMLO made. And so what we asked as outcome statements, what you're seeing here on the slide is after the exposure to these experimental treatments, we asked them a series of questions such as, should the president be able to fire judges who oppose him, disobey court rulings that go against him? Should the president have more power over the judiciary and other institutions? We asked a question that is sort of so U.S. researchers came up with is kind of meant to probe something that we refer to as institutional nihilism. So, do you agree with the idea that the problems with our institutions are so deep that they can't be fixed? So we need to tear them down and start over. So that was another of our outcome questions. Okay. Next slide, please. So these are results of how people answered these outcome questions. And what you're seeing is the average treatment effect. So this is just like what was the average level of support, for example, for an anti-democracy index among people who were in the treatment condition compared to the control condition. So what effect does this diatribe have on people's general kind of feelings against democracy or against democratic institutions? What's the average among those people who were exposed to the AMLO statements, the average level of agreement with the idea that presidents can disobey judges when they don't agree with them, that they should be able to fire judges, their kind of average level of support for a kind of institutional nihilism. We had another question about whether less power should be given to institutions other than the executive. And what you're seeing here is basically that the anti-institutional discourse, the sort of trash talk, was effective compared to people who only read the anodyne statement about the courts. Those who were exposed to criticisms were more in agreement that the president can disobey judges, should be able to fire them, and so on. So those sort of displacement of those line segments and dots to the right indicates agreement with the sort of anti-democratic positions. So in general, there was an effect, especially, and then the other thing that I want you to look at is how this breaks down among different partisan groups. So we, in addition to just looking at the average effect among everybody in the treatment group, we also looked at the effect broken down by what their partisan orientation, and that we looked at between Morena supporters, opposition party supporters, so supporters of the PRI and the PAN, and then nonpartisans. And what you're basically seeing, what's important to note here, is that there's not much difference between the effect on Morena and opposition supporters. And what you definitely are not seeing is a backlash among opposition supporters. So I said to you earlier that the partisan sort of polarizing discourse runs the risk from the perspective of an AMLO or a Trump of sort of mobilizing, counter-mobilizing opposition voters. So the question is, does trash talk as a kind of strategy get around that problem? And the evidence here is that it does. So opposition supporters were not very different in their reactions to the discourse. They also were somewhat shifted in an anti-democratic direction, not so much on institutional nihilism, but on the other points, as were the Morena supporters. And those slight differences between Morena and opposition, don't take those too seriously. Those are not statistically significant for the most part. The other thing you can notice is that nonpartisans seem to be the least influenced by this discourse. So that probably has to do with just a relative disengagement and less sensitivity to political discourse. Okay. So there does seem to be a thing that's trash talk. It's different from polarization. It is effective in undermining people, Mexicans, and I have evidence from other countries in the book, support for democratic institutions, and it doesn't seem to create a backlash among opposition voters as does partisan discourse. So I'm going to end on a little bit more positive note, I guess, and describe one more piece of our research that did uncover some power of rebuttals against the negative diatribes, ability of those rebuttals to restore some confidence in institutions. So here, this is another experiment that we ran. This is with Brett Besson of Tec de Monterrey and Andres Uribe of the University of Wisconsin. And we, again, conducted an experiment in Mexico. We exposed The institution in question was the INE, the Instituto Nacional Electoral, and what we did was expose people to a neutral description of the INE, and then to a kind of newspaper-style vignette reporting on language that President López Obrador used in a disparaging language vis-a-vis the INE, again drawing from his actual statements in Mañaneras discussions. Then we also exposed some people to that same attack, followed by a rebuttal. And one of the rebuttals that we gave them was attributed to the European Union. It actually did come off a website, an EU website, that supports the INE, that sort of describes the INE as having played a very important role in democratic transition in Mexico. We also exposed some other people to the attack statement plus a rebuttal, this time the same rebuttal, this time attributed to a domestic partisan actor, so an opposition politician. And then we also had a rebuttal that was attributed to a domestic nonpartisan source, a domestic think tank. And so if you go to the next slide, this was the international rebuttal. According to international experts, the INE ensures clean elections in Mexico. This allowed the opposition to win the presidency in 2000 after decades of one-party rule. The elections organized by the INE have allowed the alternation of political parties in charge of the federal government. So the idea is how influenced might people be to that rebuttal once they've already read the attacks on the INE. So if you go to the next slide. And the short answer is oops, go back. Eek, is it not there? Sorry. Maybe can I share my screen real quick just to show these results?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. I need to share my screen first, I guess. Do I have the ability to share my screen? Yes. Okay, good. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So what you're seeing here is the effect of these statements on people's confidence in the INE, and we measure that with a bunch of different questions. So here, displacement toward the left indicates lower confidence in the INE, and toward the right, higher confidence, and that the broken red line is 0. So if those lines, those horizontal lines cross 0, cross the broken line, that means there's no significant effect. And what you can see is the international rebuttal relative to the attack condition. Then there are two separate studies just to explain but in both cases, the international rebuttal did move people toward greater confidence in the INE. The positive effect of the international expert rebuttal matches or exceeds in size the negative effect of the initial attack. So, who knows how this translates in the real world, but in the experiment, being exposed to this rebuttal had just a stronger effect, in fact, than being exposed to the negative discourse on its own. So the international rebuttal, in fact, reversed the effect of the initial attack. So not only is it effective, but it entirely neutralizes the president's attacks. Now, if you break on the other hand, the other rebuttals didn't have much of an effect. So it wasn't effective to say that partisan or even nonpartisan domestic actors were coming to the defense of the INE. And then up there on the top panel, you're just seeing again that the attack on the INE, as the attack on the courts had a negative impact on people's views of the INE. So now, if we break this down finally by partisanship, this is a kind of confusing, it's a busy slide, so I just want to call your attention really to the fact that let's see, where are we? If you look at the top right panel, what that's telling us is that the effect of the rebuttal on from the international experts on Morena supporters had the strongest effect. That is, they were the most influenced by that rebuttal. And that may seem surprising, but it's partly probably to do with the greater effect of the attack itself. So they had a more of a bounce back that they could experience. But nevertheless, it's I think it's an encouraging result. It sort of says that partisans of backsliding leaders are not necessarily trapped in a kind of belief in the weakness or rottenness or corruption of their institutions. And there are you know there are strategies that at least proof of concept can counter those effects. I'll just close by saying, maybe that's a helpful, maybe it tells us something about how in the United States, in the United States today, some of the impact, some of the MAGA base supporters of Donald Trump seem to be not entirely impervious to new information or new discourse that they're exposed to, although they seem usually to be, inert against it. So I'll end there, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you. If you stop sharing your screen, then maybe we can see you.
Where am I? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm in
That's okay. Don't worry.
I think you need to go back to Zoom.
Okay.
And on Zoom, there'll be a button to stop share.
Yeah. For some reason, I'm on a version of Zoom. There it is. Okay, hold on. There we go.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think there's a lot that we can talk about and we want to talk about. So I will ask those of you who want to ask questions to raise your hand on the Zoom function, and I will call on you to ask your questions, and we'll do it, one by one as we always do. Let's see, Juan Wilson, you are first.
Hey, hello. Can people hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Emilio. Hi, Sue. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I have sort of two very simple kind of questions to get us started. One is that if I understood correctly, what the model that connects income inequality with democratic erosion or backsliding is measuring the probability of backsliding or probability of erosion. I just wanted to know more if there's a simple answer. Maybe it's not, and I need to go read the paper, of how do you measure the probability of erosion without taking already income inequality into factor in that sort of equation. What does allow to calculate that probability of erosion? Because it's not just a simple correlation between erosion and income inequality, but actually the idea that there is a prediction here of a possible so I was interested in that, if there's any straightforward answer to the not too complicated answer to that. And the second one is kind of a more silly question, but I like to toy with these models both ways. So I want to know if the model is useful both ways, in a sense that if there is income inequality is correlated to a certain level of a certain probability of democratic erosion, does that also mean that higher levels of income equality or redistribution would then correlate to an improvement of certain democratic features of a system? such that one could say, for example, that it is never in the interest of an authoritarian government to create to improve income distribution, because it would actually undermine the futures of the system, or that it would explain maybe why people with higher levels of income would be interested in moving towards more authoritarian tendencies to keep that sort of unequal income distribution. So those were my two questions.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. Do you want me to answer these one by one, Milo?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, great questions. Okay, so on the probabilities, this is just all we did was sort of an old-fashioned cross-national statistical study where we constructed a database that includes all democracies and observes them every year, the level of income inequality measured by Gini, and then several other measures, and whether they were a stable democracy or a backsliding democracy, and then other measures as well, GDP per capita, the age of the democracy, state institutionalization, a variety of other factors. And simply by, through regression techniques, we developed a statistical model that where the outcome is the probability of democratic backsliding. That is, how likely, it's basically the coefficient relating, income inequality to backsliding. So it's sort of, think of it this way. So the highest level of income inequality among democracies is South Africa, and South Africa, that translated into like close to 30% probability any given year of being in a state of democratic backsliding. And indeed, South Africa did experience democratic backsliding in the beginning of 2018, or under Jacob Zuma. Income inequality in Sweden is, the Gini coefficient is much lower, and that translates into a probability of democratic backsliding of 3% or something like that. And so it's not a deterministic model. It just says that these probabilities are sensitive to other factors, and one of the most important of which is income inequality. And in fact, in Sweden, happened to mention it, in my book, I talk about it as an important case of where you get the rise to power of a right-wing ethno-nationalist party, or a rise to close to power of a right-wing ethno-nationalist party, very much like right-wing ethno-nationalist parties in other places, and yet that there's enough, partisan polarization is not acute. Confidence in institutions is high. There's the mother of all welfare states is in Sweden, and people still have a sense of confidence in those institutions, and that party, despite its having real access to power, has not undertaken democratic backsliding. So that's all that's meant by those probabilities. The question about income inequality and does equality mean non-erosion, and also, to answer that question, yes, that's the other side of the statement, that inequality predicts higher levels of, or higher risk of erosion. Low levels of inequality predict the other, and same sort of story with a country like Sweden, and there are many others. Whether backsliding leaders then have a disincentive to engage in redistributive policies because they flourish in situations of inequality is a complicated one. I think that one's expectations might go in different directions. On the one hand, parties that come to power and don't seem to improve situations that they've complained about can suffer a backlash. On the other hand, it is true that that parties that we know intimately in power that complain a lot about inequality or blame the other side for being elitist and fostering inequality don't necessarily attack it very, very vigorously. So that research really has yet to be done. In fact, my colleague Eli Rao at Tech is interested in carrying it out. Yeah. Thanks, Juan.
Thank you. Alejandro Poiré, you're next.
Thank you, Emilio, Sue, for this has been very illuminating. Some people in Mexico would argue, Sue, that in fact what is happening is that over the last several years, what we think of typically as horizontal accountability institutions were actually just veto positions or veto points in favor of the elite, and that what the López Obrador and Sheinbaum administrations have done is basically a different type of democratic rule, a majoritarian democratic rule, and that can be shown in the way in which all of these veto points have been dismantled to a certain extent, and they have allowed, for the growth of the minimum wage and the pensions and all sorts of handouts, and poverty has gone down, and at least formally, allegations of human rights abuses have come down, and homicides have come down. I mean, what are we to complain about?
Yeah, it's
if I might finish, it's not just a provocation, but I think it also gets to a bigger question of if we don't take the backsliders' rhetoric as backsliding rhetoric, but as an anti-elitist diagnostic of what the democracy looked like, maybe what they're doing is right on target. No, we may or may not agree with them, but that's a different story. No.
Yeah, I mean, I personally agree with many of the policy objectives and achievements of the AMLO administration, much less so with the Trump administration. I think what the question, the really crucial question is it necessary to undermine the independence of horizontal institutions? Mexico, as you know, now has elections to the courts, federal courts at all levels, including the Supreme Court, and that has translated into a heavy partisan advantage for Morena in those elections. And I take it from my friends who have expertise in this area, much less capable, much less expert judiciary. Is it necessary to undermine confidence in election bodies to achieve those kinds of good policy outcomes? I mean, I think that we, call me old-fashioned, but I think that those kind of social democratic objectives can be achieved under democratic conditions. Now, it is absolutely true that a lot of people are willing to accept encroachments on democracy in exchange for other things that they really care about, such as low inflation or redistributive policies or a harsh set of policies vis-a-vis immigrants or what have you. The problem, there's this very nice formal paper, I think I've mentioned to you before, Alejandro, by Adam Jaworski and Xiaochan Luo, my colleague here at University of Chicago. It's a formal model, but it sort of basically says, let's say you have a government that slowly chips away at the ability of voters to hold them to account. So now we're talking about vertical accountability, and voters don't know where they are in this process, but voters like the outcomes they're getting. So you go through several kind of rounds in this, and voters say, they're in El Salvador and they see peace on the streets. They feel personal security. So who cares if the president takes the military to the legislature? And they're willing to make that trade-off. And then someday they may arrive at a moment where they're not. But all of a sudden they turn around and discover that they no longer have the ability to rein in the leader. So that's the peril. But I certainly understand, and in fact, there's good research among Mexican political scientists showing that this kind of that they're won over by an idea of illiberal democracy. So you can have democracy as in elections without all the kind of personal rights and freedoms and so forth, and with a very, very heavy concentration of power in an executive, in a kind of unconstrained executive. And people will support that. But they support it, the more popular the executive, the more they support it. The less popular the executive, the less they support it. But the problem is if we've lost our institutional ability to constrain the executive by the time we are not happy with that trade-off, then we're in a pickle.
Great. Thank you. Let's see, any other questions? I have, and you can see too if you want on the chat, a question here from Camilo Ruiz Tassinari, and I will read it. Does your model say something about the opposition's strategies? In Mexico, there is much talk that the PRI-PAN played to the tune of AMLO's polarization, but is there a party strategy that does not play to that, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Camilo. That's a great question. I'm not sure if my model does, but I think we are beginning to gather experiences that indicate successful strategies to rein in democratic backsliding and less successful strategies. And a hard lesson that we learned in the United States goes back to my response to Alejandro's question, is that people care a lot about, they have a lot of things they care about. And one of the top things that electorates in general care about is economic prosperity or stability, at least. They care about personal security. And for most people, that probably trumps their, no pun intended, it trumps their how much they care about sort of the niceties of rule of law and the like. And so it's important, it seems important for the opposition to recognize that those kinds of outcomes are going to drive a lot of elections more so than abuses of democratic rights. Now, I think we're seeing some evolution in that area in the United States because the abuses of democratic rights are coming more and more close to home for more and more people. So one lesson is it's not enough to try to win over public opinion and win elections by decrying the encroachment on democratic rights and freedoms. It's important to have other kinds of models and other kinds of values and ideals that the opposition stands for, and also a credible kind of promise to make things better for people in their daily lives. Number of these democratic backsliders have been ousted via elections, or they've been kicked out by their own political parties. That happened in South Africa. It kind of happened in the UK, although under Boris Johnson, although Johnson was kicked out before he really went too far down the path of democratic backsliding. But their parties kick them out when they look like they're unpopular. They're going to be an albatross in future elections. And so the people have a big influence on this. I guess one general response to Camilo's question: who are the actors that matter? The people matter. The people matter directly as voters. They matter as protesters, offering counter narratives and opposition to abuses by backsliding leaders. And they also matter as they can matter indirectly through their influence over political parties. And the other thing I'll mention, just in the kind of topic of what works to restore or protect democracy, is that courts have been incredibly important. And I know in Mexico that's not very comforting at this point, but in other countries, including the United States, including Poland, a whole bunch of countries, Brazil, the courts have been sometimes below the level of the apex court, but the courts in general have been an important break on the process of democratic backsliding.
Thank you. Any other questions? Raise your hand. I have a couple of very different ones. One pretty straightforward, the other one probably incoherent. So the straightforward one is, because it's a subject of great discussion in Mexico, I mean, how do you factor in, or do you factor in, this question of the empowerment of the military, as an institution in this discussion about democracy and backsliding and so on? Just curious. I mean, and of course, there's ample sort of experience with that elsewhere in Latin America, much less so directly in Mexico, but that's why it's such a rising concern. So that's one question. And then the other one, which I'll just try to get out, is, and in a way it's connected to Alejandro's question. There's a lot of people in Mexico, regular people, but also, of course, in the ruling party, that would really, vehemently reject the idea that what's going on is backsliding. I would say, why are you defending the kind of horizontal institutional distribution of power that existed before, if it was unable to produce certain kinds of results, if it was corrupt or co-opted in some kinds of ways? Why is the loss of that, such a bad thing? Now, I mean, I suppose, as you've suggested, sort of the end game is, well, that may be fine with you as long as you're happy with what the
Yes.
hopefully does.
No, they both make sense. Yeah. So starting with the military, the standard way that a political science article about democratic backsliding will start, and my book kind of starts this way too, I suppose, in some ways, is, we used to worry about military coups. Now we worry about the destruction of democracy sort of from the inside, instigated by the elected executive. But that picture is getting a little clouded when you have, cultivation of the military and politicization of the military, in countries like Mexico. In the United States, I mean, one of the most troubling development in the second Trump administration is the purging of military judges and the purging of whistleblowers in the military, and the purging of many generals and leadership, and the imposition of a defense secretary who is extremely partisan and very very few qualifications for the role. It's not unimaginable that, should another sort of 2020 type election take place, let's say the candidate is not Donald Trump, but it's J.D. Vance, and it looks like they're on their way to losing, that the effort that was made in 2020 to bring the military in to support the effort to steal the election would work. And that, the threats are all that more so now that we're seeing, the use of military forces in cities. So that is a big concern, and it's, it wasn't on my playbook because I think it's a newer development, but we saw it in Brazil as well, under Bolsonaro. So it is a huge source of concern. I guess, I don't know. I was going through the AMLO Mañaneras the other day and looking at where he talks about how, what good are judges? They don't do anything to provide agua potable, they're, and it's sort of like this, and it's the same discourse from Trump when there's a decision against him in the courts, they're unelected judges. So the sort of theory that democracy means direct accountability of any institution to the people. And by definition, then a kind of a complete collapse of any kind of horizontal controls on the executive. I think the United States is a scary country right now, and I think that's because we're seeing that kind of collapse of controls over the executive. And that doesn't mean that executives who are very heavily empowered can't get a lot of really good things done. They certainly can, but it can go very, very badly. I think the rule of law is a really, really great thing to have, and you start noticing what a great thing to have when you start losing it. I get it that there's a sort of sense of institutions that have been ineffective and are, in some cases actually corrupt. But I don't hear a discourse of anti-corruption. I don't see an effective anti-corruption effort in Mexico. High levels of corruption are really at the level of state government, and I didn't see any effort to go after, so it seems like some of this discourse, it resonates for sure and for good reasons, but it's a bit of a smokescreen when it's, not in good, when there isn't an effort to sort of restore these institutions or to make other kinds of institutions that might be constraints on one another's power that really are clean and efficient and effective. So I'm, I've had these arguments with people in Mexico. They're fascinating and I get it, but I don't find them persuasive at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, I agree. And
Also, think about the attacks on the press and universities. So the attacks, the limitation of our ability to be well informed, that's really highly problematic. So people in El Salvador know or think they know that there's been a dramatic decrease in street crime, and they're very happy about that. Who can blame them? But, the good investigative journalists have been run out of the country, and so they know very much less about what kind of deals were made with criminal gangs to get to that point. And I think that people deserve to be well informed about not just what the outcomes are, but how the outcomes happen and what kinds of constraints and what kinds of compromises have been made along the way. So I don't think it's worth it. I don't think it's worth destroying democracy to have, good outcomes. I know
yeah,
that's a stilted way of putting
no, I hear you. And actually, there's growing evidence, ample evidence that, not just at the state level, but at the federal level in Mexico, I don't know if it's a rise, but a spread of corruption, and so, I mean, that is one of the things that really sort of calls into question sort of the effectiveness or the honesty of that discourse. I mean, so, I mean, I don't disagree. I just wanted to know what you thought. Great. Okay. Well, this just sort of opens up what will surely be an ongoing conversation. We're out of time, so what remains is to thank Susan Stokes for such a thought-provoking presentation, to thank all of you for joining us here today, and to invite you to join us on our next seminar, which will be in a few weeks in the middle of February, when Rafael Rojas will join us to talk about Cuba, Venezuela, and Mexico in the current moment. Thank you, Sue Stokes. It really was wonderful to have you here, and thank all of you. Good afternoon and goodbye.
Thank you so much.